Welcome back to episode 2, Jamestown 2, and we want to talk about the development of government that would be established in the Virginia colony. Now we've talked about Jamestown, and at first it's called the Jamestown colony, but quite soon afterwards, as more settlers came and more settlements were established, like Henrico, Elizabeth City, Charles City, it will be called Virginia Colony. The first 3 charters, and remember, charters were a type of constitution or description of government system. 1606, the first charter, if you remember, established the parallel or the location at the 34th to the 45th parallel. After the starving times, the king will order a new charter, and this new charter in 1609 extends the area under the control of the Virginia colony from sea to sea. Now, there's still not a lot of information about how extensive the North America continent was, but England is claiming all the land from sea to sea in the 1609 charter. Then in 1612, because the company was still having difficulty in governing the colony, there will be another charter created, the 1612 charter, which will extend the area east to Bermuda and other West Indies islands. So Virginia colony has jurisdiction over some of those West Indian islands, including Bermuda. I have some images over to the side, and at the upper right-hand corner is an image of John Smith. Now, John Smith was among the first group of adventurers who left England and went to Jamestown. The Virginia Company, which according to the first charter, 1606 charter, the Virginia Company had sole responsibility for the government, establishing the government. So when the ships left, the men in the Virginia Company gave Captain Newport an envelope with the name of 13 men in it, and told him to keep the envelope. Nobody on board any of the other 3 ships were to know the names that were in that envelope. That he wasn't supposed to give it to them or open it until they reached land. So, as it turned out, John Smith's name was in that envelope to be one of the 13. So when they arrived on land in what would become Jamestown, and the envelope was opened, one of the men out of the 13 was to be the president, and the other men were to be the council members. Under the leadership of the first man, not much was done. Men weren't doing the work, they weren't helping to build shelters, but John Smith's name came up as the second president. And John Smith established martial law. He said, if you don't work, you don't eat. So any food provisions that they had, Smith would have locked up in a storehouse, and he would divide it up between the men who had worked. If you hadn't worked, you didn't get your allotment of food. So it was under John Smith that Jamestown was built, that the fort and dwellings were built. All the men had to put their shoulders to the wheel. They had to work. From that time on, there's pretty much going to be martial law in Jamestown. But it won't be until after 1612 that the Virginia Company tries to correct the problems in government. 1612, Virginia Company wasn't getting much return on their investment, and they were having problems, not only the starving times, but also problems in getting anything done. So the government system of the colony included, first of all, a ruling council in England. So men of the Virginia Company who stayed in England, they would be the ruling council. Then in Virginia, there would be a colonial council. These came about, it's going to improve things, but it's still not going to solve all the problems. In 1609, when the king issued the new charter, the company replaced the colonial council, totally did away with it, and instead appointed a governor. Then in 1612, more in the charter from James I, the company was given more independence in the authority over Virginia colony. And also the king gave them permission to establish a lottery to raise money for the company and for the establishment in Jamestown. So the images on the right in this PowerPoint shows Sir Thomas Gates and Sir George Yardley, who were two of the first governors that were to be in Virginia and have the authority. It was in 1619, in what was called the Great Charter, that would end the arbitrary rule of governors and elites. So up until 1619, it was the aristocrats, it was the elites who held title to most of the land and who made all the rules, who had the total authority. So in 1619, there was an end put to that, to the arbitrary rule of those governors and the elites. 1619 charter, laws were to be written, published, and obeyed. By published, it meant that people in the colony would have access to those laws, to be able to read the laws and know the laws. Also in 1619, very, very significant new body of government was created. Created a General Assembly, which was to be made up of representatives from the colony itself. So we have these several settlements now that I mentioned earlier, Henrico, Richmond, Elizabeth City, Charles City. In each of those areas, and Virginia would be divided up into what amounts to counties. Each county was to be able to choose anywhere from 2 to 7 men to send to the General Council to provide representation for each of those counties. So in other words, direct representation. Now this is something that is very new. While England was ruled by a constitutional monarchy. If you know what that means, it means that the king was subject to law. And that had been established way back in 1215 with the creation of the Magna Carta, which Magna Carta simply means the Great Charter. The Magna Charta listed the rights of English barons, that these barons in 1215 told King John that they would honor him as king and they would pay tribute to him only if he acknowledged their rights and privileges. So in the Magna Carta, with these barons listed all of their rights as Englishmen that the king had to acknowledge. The king was bound by law. And that had been the case ever since 1215. So England has this unwritten constitution, this body of laws that the king is bound by. Now, all the rest of the European countries had absolute rulers. Their kings or queens or emperors were the law. They were not bound by anything. So it was only in England. This is very important for the eventual government of the United States. So these men who have gone to the colonies, are living in the colony, they're going to directly be represented in their General Assembly. So there's going to be a governor, the governor will have a council, and then there's the General Assembly. So this is all really goes to the credit of a man named Edmund Sands. He was a leader of the opposition in the House of Commons. Again, just to make sure that we're all on the same page, we have the constitutional monarchy in England that rules with Parliament. And Parliament is made up of two houses, the House of Lords and the House of Commons. To be a member of the House of Lords, you had to be born into it. You had to be born into a family of titled men, dukes, earls, all the other English titles. They sit in the House of Lords by heritage. In the House of Commons, members are elected. Now, the elections, very different than elections will be in the United States or even in the colonies, because a man did not have to live in the area for him to be a candidate. And the House of Commons and the House of Lords they practice what is called virtual representation. In other words, every member of Parliament represents virtually every member of the British Empire, every subject in the British Empire. Virtual representation. But what is beginning in Virginia is the beginning of representative government with direct representation. Very important difference, because representatives from Henrico represent Henrico's needs and wants. People from Williamsburg represents what Williamsburg wants or needs. Direct representation. So Edmund Sands, again, is responsible for the beginning of this representative government in America. Now, a lot of times in history, we get the wrong impression that it's New England that really helps to establish what will become the government of the United States. But we can see the evidence shows that it was in Virginia colony when we get the first beginnings of representative government. So Edmund Sands believed that Virginia was the opportunity to create a perfect commonwealth. Now, I said that Sands was the leader of the opposition in Parliament, being that King James I was leaning toward trying to develop arbitrary or absolute rule, trying to take too much authority away from Parliament and given to the king. And Sands opposed that. He also opposed the privileges of the elites. What he wanted was to create a perfect commonwealth. And as one of the key terms, commonwealth simply meant that laws and actions of authority should be for the good of everyone, the common good. So Sands definitely believed in a commonwealth. He was against the monopoly of trade, and definitely in England there was a monopoly of trade. By 1619 we had the East India Company, which was established in India and in the East Indies, and there was a monopoly of the aristocracy to monopolize that trade with India and also with the West Indies. And Sands was against this. He was against the elite having this monopoly over trade. He supported a balance between private enterprise and the common good. So he wasn't wanting to destroy private enterprise, but he believed there should be a balance so that the common good was assured and that private enterprise should not take precedence. The image at the bottom there is a artist's rendering of that first meeting of the General Assembly in Virginia, what was called the House of Burgesses, held in Williamsburg. And the portrait there at the bottom is of Edmund Sands. Again, he's a very interesting character to study, and I think he doesn't get enough credit for what he started in Virginia colony that would develop into representative government. So the English system, as I've already mentioned, was a mixed constitution. That is, when political theorists of the day talked about the best form of government, it was a mixture of monarchy, aristocracy, and the common man, or democracy. And that's what you had with the king, House of Lords, and House of Commons, that mixed constitution. Now I want to talk a little bit about the populating of Virginia. So, talking about the populating of Virginia, by 1614, as I've already mentioned, there were several settlements. By 1616, the company was making a new policy about distribution of land, where they gave 50 acres to ancient, as they call them, landholders, that is, landholders who had been in Virginia colony for at least 7 years. They would get 50 extra acres, and they gave deputy governors 2,400 acres for future settlements. As far as laborers and servants, and I should mention that growing tobacco as a cash crop not only required vast amounts of land, but it also called for a tremendous number of laborers. At first, as they started growing tobacco, the individual landowners even worked in their own fields. As the need for more laborers rose, they tried to enslave Native Americans, but that didn't work out very well. Unlike the success of the Spanish, who were able to enslave indigenous populations because they came from civilizations and were accustomed to division of labor. It worked for them. But on the east coast of North America, the Indian groups, the entire group, village, everyone occupied their time obtaining food, whether it was men hunting or women gardening or growing crops. Everyone was involved in obtaining food for the group. So it did not work for the English as they tried to enslave these Indians because they weren't accustomed to that kind of lifestyle. For one thing, it was women, Indians, who worked in their fields or in the gardens, and the English were trying to enslave Indian men to do what they considered women's work. So that never was a real option for providing laborers for tobacco growth. But 1619 and 1620, the company sent over 2,400 men and boys to provide laborers. Also, they rounded up poor and vagrant children from the poor and slum areas of London. The children were forced to go or suffered death. So many poor and vagrant children ended up in Virginia colony to work in tobacco fields. Also, since for the first 12 years, it was predominantly men in Virginia, very few women. The company decided in 1619 that if they really wanted the colony to survive, that they needed families. They needed women. So the company rounded up hardworking, virtuous women, and that is a quote, to send to Jamestown. So in 1619, ships of single women arrived in Jamestown to provide wives for all the single men in the Virginia colony. The company also instituted the headright system, which is a system where if a landowner provided passage for someone to come to Virginia, that he would get 50 acres for everyone that he provided passage to come over. Also, anyone coming to America paying their own passage received 50 acres. And those new settlers who paid for their own passage plus passage for other people, they could get 50 acres for everyone that they provided passage to get to Virginia. So the headright system filled the need for much of the labor in the 1600s in Virginia, but also indentured servants. These are people willing to leave England, perhaps even anxious to leave England, to go to America, that would sign a contract for anywhere from 4 to 7 years to work for a landowner, and at the end of that contract they were to get a parcel of land and the means to start on their own. So there were many indentured servants, hundreds of people who came to Virginia through the indentured servant contracts. The sad thing is that many of those indentured servants never were able to fulfill their contracts and get that extra land, because the law was on the side of the landowner, and the landowner could establish any rules, any laws, And if the indentured servant broke any of those laws, he could have years added to his contract. So not very many of them were able to survive their years as an indentured servant. And they were pretty much slaves. They had very little freedoms, and they were often treated very harshly. There were very few African slaves used in the South until after the 1660s, 1670s. Now, the first Africans to arrive in Jamestown came in 1619. They had escaped from a Dutch slave ship, but were brought in by another English captain, brought into Jamestown. But they were not brought in as slaves, and in fact, some of them even ended up, if you read the census records, ended up as freemen and even landowners. So slavery was not a big issue in the South until really the beginning of the 18th century. Another means that the company attempted to populate Virginia and also to arrive at some profit was by finding artisans from all over Europe, recruiting them to go to Virginia. For instance, they recruited Frenchmen to go to Virginia to plant grapevines and to husband the vineyards. They also recruited German glassblowers, hoping to profit from glass items, Italians to make glass beads, which they used to trade with the Indians, Poles from Poland to make potash. They even tried to bring silkworms from the east and hoping to create a silk industry in Virginia. So all of these people from these different areas of Europe ended up in Virginia. However, none of those attempts at a way of reaping profits worked. They all eventually ended without being successful. It's the wealthy elite in the South who own the land. They're the ones who exercise power in government, and therefore in the South, not only in Virginia, but also in the other southern colonies, what develops is a society based on class division, social hierarchy, so that through the South you have the elites, and way at the bottom you have the poor and eventually slaves. But it's the tobacco planters who dominate the economy in the South until they start growing also rice, indigo, and like I said later on, cotton. But all of those crops, all four of those crops, require large amounts of land, large numbers of laborers, and also takes up the land so that you don't have close neighbors. You might have to walk a day or two to get to the nearest town. So sparse population. Images at the bottom show people working in the tobacco fields. The colored image at the bottom is a tobacco plantation. The different steps that you go through to produce tobacco leaves that are eventually put into the hogshead, which is the image there where you see the horse pulling this huge barrel-like thing, which is called a hogshead, which is full of tobacco leaves. And then those same barrels or hogsheads of tobacco leaves being put on board ships. And the landowner there obviously negotiating with the buyers. So in the South, a planter class, social hierarchy, and very much a specific culture that will be specific to the South. Thank you for viewing. I hope you will, if you haven't already subscribed, hope you'll subscribe and watch for the next episode. Thank you.